How do you tell the difference between self-love and just being selfish? I see all the time about people setting their boundaries and claiming their peace, which is great, but at what point does it go from preserving oneself to being over the top and hurting other people by our demands?
Self-love is not demanding of anyone else, right? The minute we get into the space where we're like, well, this is my truth and therefore this is what you get to do or not do, we're moving into a realm of control. So again, we've got these two concepts enmeshed. They need to be unenmeshed. Self-love ultimately must include the love of others. I know that for some of you, it's going to be very important for you to tap into your own best interests and almost treat taking other people's best interest as a secondary step to that because you have been so hyper-trained towards the opposite. But this is why I say that. At a universal level, everything is one. So ultimately, at this certain level of existence, there's no difference between self-love and the love of others. It's all self-love. However, here we are in this time-space reality where we experience some degree of separation, where we have, our own best interests, and sometimes it can come into the conflict with somebody else's best interests. When we're in that type of situation, obviously it's best to look for a win-win scenario. And when people profoundly do love themselves, and I mean genuinely love themselves, you will see that natural inclination towards a win-win scenario. What you're watching when you're watching people who are slipping into this sort of self-centered behavior is that this is an individual who came from an experience, usually a family experience, of extreme dysfunction. Now, the message that is inherent as the foundation of a dysfunctional family dynamic is every man is actually for himself or herself. And in that family, even if you're looking at codependent strategies where it seems like there's a member of the family that's always putting other people first and is almost like sacrificing themselves, it's not actually for other people. That self-sacrificing behavior is innately self-centered. It's the strategy they specifically found that they think is going to get them their needs met, right? So everybody in this family dynamic is essentially acting in their own best interests. Now, what'll happen, especially if you're dealing with almost like somebody who falls more to the codependent strategy technique in their early life, once they get into self-love, they don't have a context for what that looks like in a healthy way. All they have seen in their life is people prioritizing themselves in a much more direct way. So what you usually see is somebody swinging the pendulum from codependent strategies over to like overtly narcissistic strategies. So it looks like that pendulum swing where all of a sudden you've got somebody who's like, I don't really care the impact on you because it's about self-love, And so what's important to understand is it's not like when you go on this journey to self-love, you need to be aware of some kind of arbitrary line where you cross it and all of a sudden you're in a space of selfishness. Because underneath that selfishness is the perception of scarcity, ultimately, which has nothing to do with self-love. It's just that in committing to self-love, you're running into that basic dysfunctional thinking and way of being within relationships and within the world. So it's the dysfunction that needs to be dealt with. Again, we need to enmesh the concept of practicing self-love, or unenmesh this practice of self-love from the dysfunctional family dynamic with which we grew up in, because we're sort of enmeshing them and then applying one to the other and then swinging the pendulum over to this narcissistic behavior, which is just every man for himself. And now I have a great spiritual excuse to do so, which I could never do in my childhood in a direct way like my brother or mother or whatever could. In a space of self-love, right? What you're profoundly doing is learning how to directly act in the best interests of your aspects, how to profoundly re-own aspects that you have disowned. And from there, you come up with a powerful personal truth. That powerful personal truth is just your truth. Now, that's one piece of the puzzle. You get to look at the other person's personal truth and try to find that win-win scenario. And if you can't find a full-blown win-win, what you're looking for is the highest and best for both people. Right? So I like all this to say it's very important to understand that demands is not about self-love. Demanding other people behave in a certain way is just us falling back into that dysfunctional dynamic where we feel like we have to fight for our own best interests against other people. And there may be times, people may put you in a horrible zero-sum game over the course of your life. There may be times where you have to act profoundly in alignment with what is in your best interest, but you can actually make it so that's not necessarily against. even though the way that you behave is not ultimately what the other person would quote unquote want. You don't have to make it such a against you or such a, because this is my truth, you have to, fill in the blank, do something or act in a different way. Anytime we're getting out of the zero-sum game, basically, which is a profoundly self-loving act, we're moving more and more and more towards self-love. Here's the reason I say that, right? We as people struggle immensely at understanding that it's not possible to play a zero-sum game with anything else in existence without it ultimately hurting us. So ultimately, if we do play a zero-sum game with something or somebody else, that will come back to bite us somehow, which is why it's so important to make that differentiation vibrationally between me acting very powerfully for what is my healing, rather than me needing other people to behave in a specific way because of what I need, right? All right, so the more that you weave through and work through your interpersonal dynamics in childhood, the more that you develop trust in your relationships with other people and make them safe, the more self-loving we are going to be. These are, again, two concepts that are like symbiotic, but we're not treating them as if we're symbiotic because we grew up in these dysfunctional situations where we feel like self-love ultimately has to be against somebody else or has to be demanding of somebody else, when it doesn't.